Story 1. I'd always been fascinated by the attic of our old Victorian house. It was a labyrinth of dusty rooms, filled with forgotten treasures and the musty scent of time. I loved to spend hours exploring its nooks and crannies, imagining the stories that the walls could tell. One day, while rummaging through a chest of old clothes, I heard a strange noise coming from the far end of the attic. It was a faint scratching sound, like a small animal trapped behind the wall. Curiosity piqued, I crept towards the source of the sound. As I got closer, the scratching became louder and more insistent. I pressed my ear against the wall, trying to make out what was causing the noise. Suddenly, the wall seemed to bulge outwards. With a loud crash, a small, dark figure burst through the plaster. It was a creature unlike anything I had ever seen before. Its body was long and serpentine, with leathery skin that shimmered in the dim light. It had large, glowing red eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. Its claws were long and sharp, and its mouth was filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth. I screamed and stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. The creature hissed and lunged at me, its claws extended. I managed to dodge the attack, but I knew I was no match for its speed and agility. Desperation fueled me as I scrambled towards the attic door. I fumbled with the latch, my hands shaking. The creature was gaining on me, its claws inches from my back. With a final burst of strength, I managed to swing the door open and tumble down the stairs. I slammed the attic door behind me, locking it securely. Panting and trembling, I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. I looked up at the attic window, expecting to see the creature peering down at me. But it was gone. For weeks, I couldn't shake the image of the creature from my mind. I tried to convince myself that it had been a dream, a figment of my imagination. But I knew deep down that it was real. One night, I couldn't sleep. The thought of the creature kept me awake. I decided to go downstairs and get a glass of water. As I passed the attic door, I hesitated. A strange feeling washed over me, as if I was being watched. I forced myself to continue walking, but I couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. I stopped and turned back to the attic door. A cold draft swept through the hallway, and I heard a faint scratching sound coming from inside. My heart raced. I knew what it was. The creature was still there, trapped in the attic. I had to do something. Gathering my courage, I reached for the doorknob and turned it slowly. The door creaked open, revealing a pitch-black void. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The attic was dark and silent. I fumbled for the light switch, my hands shaking. As soon as the light came on, I saw it. The creature was curled up in the corner, asleep. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Should I try to kill it? Or should I leave it alone? Before I could decide, the creature stirred. Its eyes opened, and it looked at me with a cold, calculating gaze. It hissed and lunged at me, its claws extended. I screamed and ran for my life, the creature hot on my heels. I burst through the attic door and slammed it shut behind me. I leaned against the wall, panting and trembling. The creature was trapped inside, its claws scratching at the door. I didn't know if I would ever see it again, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never go back into the attic. The attic entity was a creature of darkness, a force of evil that I could never understand, and I was glad that it was trapped. Story 2. Every morning, I'd find the garden perfectly tended, the weeds pulled, the flowers pruned, but I'd never seen anyone do it. The neighbors said it was old Mrs. Willow, who had lived there for decades before passing away. They said she loved her garden more than anything. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. Maybe the neighbors were taking care of it for me. But as the days turned into weeks, I realized that there was something more going on. The garden was always immaculate, even when it had rained the night before. And I'd never seen anyone enter or leave the house. One morning, I decided to stay up late and watch the garden. I hid behind a curtain, my heart pounding with anticipation. As the clock struck midnight, a faint glow began to emanate from the garden. I peered out the window and saw a ghostly figure tending to the flowers. It was Mrs. Willow, her translucent form shimmering in the moonlight. She worked with a gentle touch, her movements graceful and precise. As I watched, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. Mrs. Willow was a kind and loving woman, and it was clear that her spirit still found joy in tending to her garden. I continued to watch Mrs. Willow for many nights. She would appear just after midnight, her ghostly form fading into the darkness as the sun began to rise. I felt a strange connection to her, as if we were somehow linked by our shared love of the garden. One evening, I decided to talk to Mrs. Willow. I went outside and sat on a bench in the garden. I closed my eyes and spoke aloud, my voice barely a whisper. "Mrs. Willow," I said, "thank you for taking care of my garden. I appreciate everything you do." There was a brief silence, and then I felt a gentle breeze brush against my face. I opened my eyes and looked around, but there was no one there. Yet, I knew that Mrs. Willow had heard me. From that day on, I felt a deep sense of peace and tranquility in my home. I knew that Mrs. Willow was watching over me, and I was grateful for her presence. And every morning, I would go out to the garden and thank her for her beautiful work. One day, as I was tending to the flowers, I felt a strange sensation. It was as if Mrs. Willow was standing beside me. I looked up, but there was no one there. Yet I could feel her presence, a warm, comforting feeling that filled me with joy. As I continued to work, I realized that Mrs. Willow was more than just a ghost. She was a friend, a companion, a part of my life, and I was grateful for her unwavering love and support. Story 3. My kitchen was a disaster. Pots and pans flew off the shelves, dishes shattered on the floor. I thought I was going crazy until I saw it. A small, invisible force seemed to be moving objects around. I tried to capture it on camera, but the batteries always died. At first, I tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just a strange coincidence. But as the days turned into weeks, the problem only got worse. The poltergeist, as I had started to call it, seemed to be growing stronger. It would throw objects at me, slam doors, and even turn off the lights. I tried everything I could think of. I called a priest, a psychic, and even a ghostbuster. But nothing seemed to work. The poltergeist was determined to make my life a living hell. I started to feel isolated and alone. My friends and family were worried about me, but they couldn't understand what I was going through. I felt like I was losing my mind. One night, as I was sitting at the kitchen table, the poltergeist decided to make its presence known. It started to throw objects at me, harder and faster than ever before. I ducked and dodged, but I couldn't escape its relentless attacks. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, something strange happened. The poltergeist stopped. It was as if it had lost interest in me. I looked around, my heart pounding in my chest. The kitchen was silent, except for the faint ticking of the clock. I slowly got up and walked over to the window. As I looked out, I saw a figure standing in the garden. It was a young girl, no more than 10 years old. She was staring up at the house, her eyes filled with sadness. I felt a pang of sympathy for the girl. I knew that she was probably the source of the poltergeist activity. She was probably angry or upset about something, and she was taking it out on me. I went outside and approached the girl. She looked at me warily, her eyes filled with fear. I tried to calm her down, but she just backed away. "Please," I said, "I don't want to hurt you. I just want you to stop scaring me." The girl hesitated, then nodded slowly. She turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. From that day on, the poltergeist activity stopped. I never saw the girl again, but I knew that she was gone. I was finally free. Story 4. I was working on a research vessel, the Nautilus, when strange things started happening. At first, it was just a series of minor inconveniences, equipment malfunctions, strange noises, and the occasional unexplained chill. But as the days turned into weeks, the occurrences became more frequent and more disturbing. The crew began to report seeing ghostly figures on the deck. Some described them as shadowy apparitions, while others claimed to have seen actual people walking the planks. I was skeptical at first, but as the sightings became more widespread, I couldn't deny the possibility of something supernatural. One night, I was on watch in the engine room when I heard a strange noise coming from the deck. It was a sound like someone walking across the planks, but there was no one there. I went up to investigate, my heart pounding in my chest. As I stepped onto the deck, a cold wind swept through the air. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. Just as I was about to turn back, I saw it. A figure was standing at the railing, staring out at the ocean. It was a man, dressed in old-fashioned sailor's clothes. I approached the figure cautiously. As I got closer, I realized that it was translucent, almost like a ghost. The man turned and looked at me, his eyes filled with a sad, haunted expression. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. The man didn't answer. He just continued to stare at me, his eyes filled with a deep sorrow. I tried to leave, but the man reached out and grabbed my arm. I felt a chill run down my spine as his icy fingers touched my skin. "Help me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Please help me." Before I could respond, the man vanished, leaving me alone on the deck. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew that I had just encountered something truly extraordinary. The following days were filled with a sense of unease. The ghostly sightings became more frequent, and the crew was starting to panic. Some of them even refused to leave their cabins at night. I decided to do some research into the history of the Nautilus. I discovered that the ship had a dark past. It had been involved in several tragic incidents, including a shipwreck that had claimed the lives of many sailors. I realized that the ghost I had seen was probably one of those lost souls. He was trapped on the ship, unable to find peace. I felt a deep sense of sympathy for the ghost. I knew that there was nothing I could do to help him, but I wanted to at least try. I went to the captain and told him about my encounter. The captain was skeptical at first, but he eventually agreed to let me try to contact the ghost. I went to the deck where I had seen the man and spoke aloud. "If you're there," I said, "please let me know. I want to help you." There was a brief silence, and then I felt a cold breeze brush against my face. I looked up, but there was nothing there. Yet, I knew that the ghost had heard me. From that day on, the ghostly sightings became less frequent. The crew was relieved, and the atmosphere on the ship began to return to normal. I never saw the ghost again, but I knew that he was at peace, and I was grateful that I had been able to help him. Story 5. I was watching a play at the old Grand Theater when I felt a strange presence. The lights flickered, and the actors seemed to be moving in slow motion. I looked up and saw a ghostly figure sitting in the balcony. The figure was a woman, dressed in a long, flowing gown. She had long, flowing hair that cascaded down her shoulders, and her eyes were a haunting shade of blue. She was staring at me, her expression one of sadness and longing. I tried to ignore her, but it was impossible. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I could feel her eyes boring into me, as if she were trying to reach out and touch me. The play continued, but I couldn't focus. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it just my imagination? Or was there really something supernatural happening? As the play reached its climax, the ghostly figure stood up and walked towards the edge of the balcony. She leaned over and looked down at the audience, her eyes filled with a strange, otherworldly light. Then she vanished. I jumped to my feet and ran out of the theater. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I was shaking uncontrollably. I tried to convince myself that it had all been a dream, but I knew deep down that it was real. I went back to the theater the next day, determined to find out more about the ghostly figure. I spoke to the theater manager, a man named Mr. Fat Jenkins. He told me that the theater was haunted. "It's been like that for years," he said. "People have reported seeing all sorts of strange things. Ghosts, apparitions, you name it." Mr. Jenkins told me that the woman in the balcony was the ghost of a famous actress who had performed on the theater's stage many years ago. She had been tragically killed in a car accident on her way home from a performance. I was fascinated by the story. I had always been interested in the supernatural, and the idea of a haunted theater was incredibly exciting to me. I returned to the theater many times over the next few weeks. I would sit in the balcony where I had seen the ghost, hoping to catch a glimpse of her again. But she never appeared. One night, as I was sitting alone in the theater, I felt a strange sensation. It was as if someone was standing behind me. I turned around, but there was no one there. Then I heard a soft whisper. "Help me," it said. I jumped to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked around, but there was no one there. The theater was empty. I sat down again, my mind racing. Who was it that had spoken to me? Was it the ghost of the actress, or was it something else entirely? Just as I was about to give up, I heard the whisper again. "Please," it said, "help me." I stood up and walked towards the stage. As I approached the curtain, I felt a cold draft sweep through the theater. The lights flickered, and I heard a faint sound like a sigh. Then I saw her. The ghostly figure of the actress was standing on the stage, her eyes filled with sadness and longing. "Please," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "help me leave this place." I didn't know what to do. I felt a deep sense of compassion for the ghost, but I didn't know how I could help her. Suddenly, an idea came to me. I reached out and touched the curtain. As I did so, a bright light filled the theater. The ghost of the actress seemed to be drawn to the light. She took a step forward, and then she was gone. I stood there for a moment, stunned. I had done it. I had helped the ghost find peace. As I walked out of the theater, I felt a sense of satisfaction. I had experienced something truly extraordinary, something that I would never forget. And I knew that I would always remember the haunted theater. Story 6. I lived in an old Victorian house, a place steeped in history and mystery. The creaking floorboards, the drafty windows, and the eerie silence that often enveloped the house added to its otherworldly atmosphere. But it was the ghostly child who truly made it feel haunted. Every night, I'd hear a child's laughter coming from the attic. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, playing tricks on me in the quiet of the night. But the laughter persisted, growing louder and more insistent over time. One night, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed the narrow, winding staircase to the attic. The space was filled with dust and cobwebs, the air thick with the scent of decay. I moved cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. As I ventured deeper into the attic, the laughter grew louder. It seemed to be coming from a small, dimly lit room at the far end of the hall. I approached the room slowly, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Inside, I found a small, child-sized bed. The sheets were rumpled as if someone had been sleeping there. I shone my flashlight around the room, searching for any sign of the child. Suddenly, I heard a soft giggle. I turned around and saw a small, translucent figure standing in the corner of the room. It was a child, no more than 5 years old. She had long, flowing hair and bright, sparkling eyes. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The child smiled at me, her face filled with a sense of joy. She reached out her tiny hand as if inviting me to come closer. I hesitated for a moment, but then I took a step forward. The child's smile grew wider and she began to dance around the room. Her laughter filled the air, a sound that was both haunting and beautiful. I watched her for a long time, mesmerized by her ethereal beauty. She seemed so happy and carefree, as if she were oblivious to the world around her. As I watched, the child began to fade. Her laughter grew quieter, and her form became more translucent. Soon, she was nothing more than a faint shimmer in the air. I stood there for a moment, feeling a sense of loss. The ghostly child had brought a strange kind of joy into my life, and now she was gone. But I knew that she would always be with me, a reminder of the mysterious and magical things that exist beyond our understanding. From that day on, I never heard the child's laughter again. But I often thought about her, and I wondered what had happened to her. Was she lost? Was she trapped in the attic? Or had she finally found peace? I may never know the answers to these questions, but I will always remember the ghostly child and the strange, beautiful experience of sharing a moment with her in the haunted attic of my Victorian home. Story 7. We were bored and decided to try a Ouija board. At first it was fun, but then the planchette started moving on its own, spelling out chilling messages. We tried to stop it, but it was too late. The board was possessed. It started innocently enough. Sarah, a resident skeptic, had bought the Ouija board at a flea market. She insisted it was just a toy, a way to pass the time on a rainy afternoon. But as we gathered around the board, a strange energy seemed to fill the room. We placed our fingers lightly on the planchette, a small triangular piece of wood that was supposed to move freely across the board. At first, nothing happened. We laughed and joked, trying to coax the planchette into motion. Then, slowly, the planchette began to move. It hovered over the letter Y, then moved to E, and finally settled on S. We looked at each other, our excitement growing. Yes, we asked, our voices barely a whisper. The planchette moved again, this time spelling out the word, hello. We were thrilled. We had contacted a spirit. We asked the spirit its name. It spelled out Abraham. We were intrigued. Abraham was a biblical name, but we didn't know anyone with that name. We continued to ask questions and the planchette continued to answer. Abraham said he was happy to be contacted and that he had been watching us for a long time. He said he was a friendly spirit and meant no harm. We were relieved. We had been a little scared at first, but now we were starting to enjoy ourselves. We asked Abraham all sorts of questions about his life, his death, and the afterlife. But then, things started to get strange. The planchette began to move more erratically, spelling out words that didn't make sense. It started to write in cursive, and the handwriting was strange and unfamiliar. We tried to stop the planchette, but it was too late. It was possessed. The planchette began to spell out chilling messages. It said that we were in danger. It said that Abraham was not who he claimed to be. It said that he was going to hurt us. We tried to ignore the messages, but they were too terrifying to ignore. We tried to remove our hands from the planchette, but it seemed to be stuck to our fingers. Then we heard a strange noise coming from the other room. It sounded like someone was scratching at the door. We looked at each other, our faces pale with fear. We tried to get up, but our bodies felt heavy and sluggish. We were trapped. Just as the scratching at the door became louder, the planchette stopped moving. The room fell silent, except for the sound of our own terrified breathing. Then we heard a voice. It was a deep, guttural voice that sent chills down our spines. "You have disturbed me," the voice said. "Now you will pay." With that, the lights went out and we were plunged into darkness. We could hear the scratching at the door getting closer and closer.